Ladies and gentlemen, the second panel for the day, if you haven't seen enough of the earlier discussion, now the topic is lack of access or lack of understanding. Why does the foreign media get it wrong in its coverage of certain countries? Ladies and gentlemen, they say your pain is the breaking of shell of your understanding. If that is the case, then the earlier topic we just announced, lack of access or lack of understanding, why the foreign media get it wrong in its coverage of certain countries, is extremely relevant. Whether you agree or not agree, or somewhere in between, certainly this topic has been fascinating us for years, if not decades. Therefore, I would like to really have the honor to introduce to the stage a panel of distinguished professionals to hear their thoughts coming from very different perspectives and angles. My great honor to introduce to the stage Mr. Yang Fuqing, Deputy Director of CGTN English Channel. 有请 CGTN 英语频道副总监杨富庆先生。Mr. Phil Chetwynd, Global Editor-in-Chief of AFP. 法新社全球总编辑 Phil Chetwynd， 按照这个顺序做就可以了。好。Mr. Liu Luningsi, who is the Director of News and Editor-in-Chief of Phoenix Info News Channel. Welcome, Mr. Liu. Mr. Jamie Ho, who just spoke to you earlier, Chief Editor of Digital News in Channel News Asia. 亚洲新闻台新媒体部总编辑 Jamie Ho. Last but certainly not least, Vivian Wu, Hong Kong Bureau Chief of BBC World Service, BBC 英国广播公司香港业务总监 Vivian Wu. 有请。Thank you. What a pleasure to have a whole panel of professionals. I think my job is getting ever easier as we speak. I can just pose simple questions, and I'm sure you're going to give us a whole spectrum of views and insights. Let me begin by asking every one of you, ladies and gentlemen, what are some of the stories you've been repeatedly thinking these days and wonder whether you get it right, quote unquote, or not yet, quote unquote? Of course, we could have a debate about what is right, what is wrong for a whole hour, but let's put that aside. Let's just ask one example from every one of you. What's that story? Mr. Yang.
Okay, when we look for stories, there are several factors we would take into consideration. First of all, of course, news value. In terms of both, whether there's like interest from the audience, and also news value in terms of whether it's kind of falls to the mission of our channel, and more and more eventually we're looking at stories more towards stories that will generate much interest from the digital side. So are they, stories, are they going to be hot on the internet or, on social media or mobile, things like that? And also when we talk about these stories, we also think about factors like whether we can do good shows or good stories out of these pieces. And also we're looking at the stories on a global context, whether, we can do a story in terms of we putting, some China stories in a global context or other stories in a global context. I can just give you an example. Last year, it was like the 16th anniversary of 9/11. And I think most people would think that's not a big anniversary. It's just the 16th anniversary. And our feedback from the United States is also that people are like paying more attention to the hurricane, which is right now, just landing in some parts of southeastern the United States. But I think, even though it's only the 16th anniversary of 9/11, but in the previous year, a lot of terrorist attacks happened in Europe, in Middle East, and elsewhere in the world, So I think it certainly has news value, and also that I believe that we can do it differently. We can do the story from a global perspective. That means we are looking at, such as the root causes of terrorism, and also the new trend in terrorist attacks. And the 9/11 is global impact, in addition to impact on the United States. So that's why we did a 2.5-hour live show on our channel. And CNN, of course, did a much longer show, but it's coupled with updates on the hurricane and other stories. It's kind of not continuous coverage, but we have 2.5-hour coverage, and all the other international broadcasts, they did very little on that show. But I still believe that we did the right thing. We cover this story from a different global perspective. So that's what we always
one fresh example coming from Mr. Yang. By the way, he's my boss, but I feel very good about asking questions to him on the stage this time, turning the table. Thank you so much, Mr. Yang. Let's go to Mr. Chetwynd. If there's one story responding to your colleague from China, what is that story for you, and what are some of the priorities when you are getting your stories?
I think for us, for the last 2 years or so, it's hard to look beyond the consequences of the election of Mr. Donald Trump. It's hard to look beyond the Brexit referendum, and indeed the whole wave of what you would broadly call populist movements in Europe and elsewhere. Because I think that's really challenged societies, or many societies, to look more deeply at what is the real conversation going on in those societies. So that's been a huge moment of reflection for us, to really look at everything we're doing and to try and say, are we telling all sides of the story? What sides of the story did we miss? How did we do it? What is the language that we're using to tell this story? So this, within the agency, this turned into quite a major reflection, which we broadly call post-Trump Brexit, but really reflects that these are global trends, and ultimately it was a very positive process, because where did it bring us back to? It brought us back to having to look through this moment where we're in at the moment, where new forces are emerging, a lot of misinformation, what people broadly call fake news, although I'm not really crazy about that term. And so what did it come back to internally? It came down internally to a need to absolutely double down on the qualities of the agency, our sourcing guidelines, our determination to be accurate, our determination to tell the story consistent with the values of our organization. So in fact, it was a very, very positive process.
Abstract, your answer, just as the earlier part of Mr. Yang's as well. But I want you to give us an example. I don't want to be carried away by President Trump, because he has been there every day, every morning on his own tweet. But this is an interesting example that the media has failed as a whole, in a way, to be able to see there might be a very different newcomer in the American landscape, political landscape. That could be one example. There could be an example from the other area. So one example from you, sir.
Yeah, I think there's a little bit of dramatization of the failure. I think one of the issues you have to take into mind, one of the constant sort of returns that we've come to with both Brexit and Trump, is to double down on on-the-ground reporting. It's extremely important that you maintain reporting in areas where perhaps, because news budgets are under pressure, you sort of pulled back. So that's been one of the very positive things, is that we get more people out there, more people out in areas where perhaps we weren't, as in not the big cities. But that's something very concrete that's come from what we're doing. Yeah.
Mr. Liu, are we really feeling the real pulse of societies, of countries, and the dramatic change that is really happening around us? Are we media, business as usual, while everything around us have been changing? Mr. Liu.
出现了变化，还工作方式没有发生改变。Thank you very much. Allow me to answer your question in Chinese. I think what we're here to talk about today is very meaningful, and it's also necessary to talk about something like this: the lack of access or the lack of understanding. Is it an individual case, or is it something that we common? When I was invited over here, I was under the impression I was going to talk about why there is mistrust from foreign organizations on media organization from China, but I think it's a two-way street.
So that's why I would like to speak in Chinese, because I'm trying to make myself clear. I'm not sure if I can speak it in a clear way in Chinese. We are all from the media background, and we all know. Just now, moderator Liu Xin mentioned a Chinese saying: we adopt different perspectives to look at the same story, and we share the same belief. We are differently positioned. We have the relationship with the government to deal with. We have to deal with the relationship with the authorities, powers, with the commercial partners. Traditional media has to deal with the relationship with the we media, new media, and our relationship with the grassroots, with our peers in foreign countries. So it's quite complicated. You ask for examples, I will give you two. In March this year, UK media reported a murder of a Russian spy, and we see totally different coverage of the same story in Russia and in UK. Second example, Donald Trump has been criticizing CNN and the New York Times. They were being accused of making fake news. So not so long ago, a lot of newspapers of the United States made a joint statement to respond to Donald Trump's accusation. I remember clearly the content from the New York Times proposal or letter of petition. They say that we are all professional media organizations, but sometimes we make mistakes. We ask for the supervision and comments of all the users and audience. So the two examples show that we would like to stick to our value proposition and our principles, but sometimes simply because of different perspectives, we cannot do that. 没有人说信息是公平。
When we cover the news, even as media personnel, that we are not going to cover it without any degree of bias. But the question is, how to lessen the bias to the least degree? That is the question that needs to be asked. Yes, we are human beings, but we also have a title called a journalist. So that is the question I want to throw out over there to Mr. Ho, coming from Channel News Asia. How do you see that, your example?
Let me first say that going back to the right or wrong,
quote-unquote right and wrong.
Quote-unquote right or wrong.
Right.
When it comes to obviously reporting news and the facts, we, like everyone else, hope to get it right all the time. That is non-negotiable. The question then comes when you're talking about analysis, you're talking about commentary, you're talking about deeper insights on your reporting. And since you raised Brexit and the election of President Donald Trump, yes, I think, as has been suggested, that sort of reflected a certain getting it wrong in terms of the forecasting, in terms of the analysis. And even as a small country, coming from a small country and a small player, I think it was very, very important for us because it reflected how news organizations, whether through overdependence on polls and surveys, got the ground quite wrong. And I think that is important for all news media organizations to reflect upon how well they report on and they are reflective of their audiences. And I think it is imperative that all of us reflect on that. Even as I said, as a small country, we have done that too.
An example?
An example is, again, going back to the issue at hand, every day, therefore, whether it's the smallest news stories or the largest news stories, we ask ourselves the questions, is this important for our audience? Is it reflective of our audience? And if we tell the story, so what? So it's a conversation we have every day. When we carry one story, are we carrying it the right way? Are we telling the right narrative? And does our audience out care? Because as I've said, if you go back to what has happened in other societies, danger that you have to avoid is when the societies and the audiences find themselves distanced from and kind of not reflected by their news media organizations.
I would like Jamie to ponder a little bit and think about a concrete example and provide to us a little bit later. But for now, Vivian, Ms. Wu, let me go to you. The only female journalist we have seen on the panel. Congratulations. And by the way, how do you, from the BBC's perspective, so-called get it right, get it wrong, access or actually lack of information?
Okay, I think both access and trust are important. But we can maybe spend an hour to discuss this. So I just skip the conceptual discussions. But here I think I want to share from two perspectives. One is from BBC value. It's like we as a traditional media organization with long-term legacy. Sometimes legacy is really good because we have a good branding for being truthful, trusted, being impartial and neutral. But what do you mean by impartiality? What do you mean by neutrality? This actually is something we discuss every day in the newsroom. What we do at BBC, I think advantage and disadvantage is we're global. What do you mean by global? It's like you have to position yourself as a foreign press. I mean, any region you are based or you cover. That could be an advantage because you, by default, you stand from a more detached position. You avoid being dragged into the local debates. Sometimes so hard to not to take sides as a person. For example, you want to have example. We are based in Hong Kong as a production center. Both take care of the English coverage on the Greater China area. Also, we take care of the production from English, other languages into Chinese. So when we cover China-US trade war, for example, we at least have to address 3 angles of the story. You need to go into the details, what the Chinese government say about this war, so-called war, and what their positions. You also need to analyze why the US government has taken some actions in that so-called war. But you also need to keep in mind what is an international perspective and what is a global context for such debate, because such wars, such conflict also has a global impact on every country. So what we try to do is like we address 3 angles for one story. This is about being detached. But what the disadvantage is like you are always regarded as a foreign, so pre-perception always exists. I was talking with Phil about a very simple question we always encounter. When you start a conversation, people always ask me, where are you from? Then I need to think 3 seconds to answer that question. Because that question implies perceptions about your cultural background, your nationality, your position in the political and culture context. So to end my question to your answer to your question, it's like we keep the pre-perception in mind, but we try to always highlight the differences, but still address the most important question without ignoring the importance of the trust and importance of the access. Yeah.
I remember very clearly when I was a correspondent in Washington during the Bush administration, the question people asked me first is also, where are you from? Which media organization exactly are you belonging to? Very interesting question over there. Coming to you, since you talk about China-US apparent trade war, Mr. Yang, I'm sure that is also a topic that you and your newsroom have to handle on a daily basis. given China is a player in the debate. So how do you, as a executive manager of the news side, coming from a Chinese news organization, I mean, at least you're based in China, how are you seeing that balance that earlier our colleagues have been touched on?
Yeah, I think for the U.S.-China trade, I've always tell our staff to be presenting your perspectives or make your comments based on facts. So that's what we always do in our newsroom. So when we do stories, we have to, base the story on facts. For example, we did a story or a feature program, which is like less than half an hour long, debunking U.S.-China trade. First of all, we did a lot of math, okay? We present a lot of facts. We're not just, kind of presenting some kind of sort of, criticism or whatever, or attacks on the U.S. government's position or what. But we did a story based on facts and figures. So that's what our, editorial policy on U.S.-China trade issue and on many other issues too.
Therefore, go to you, Phil. I mean, it's well known that a state leader coming from a certain country could have already 5,000 misinformation during the first few months he's in the office. And therefore, the question is very relevant, the role of the media. That whether you quote as if everything being said is the truth and repeat them so that it eventually become almost truth to people, or you give critical analysis with the risks that the audience might lose interest in the process of your analysis. I think that's a critical choice, particularly a wire service like yours probably have to choose on a daily basis. Phil, your thought about that in relation to what Mr. Yang just earlier said about the facts, reporting about the facts, especially in an apparent war, there are two parties.
Well, I mean, I would agree. I think the context at the moment of trying to report in real time, live, which we have to remember, we basically work in two contexts at the moment, which is live and social media driven. So it's extremely loud and it's extremely fast.
Absolutely.
So at the same time, what are you trying to do? You're trying to report in real time in a measured, controlled, and accurate way with many actors, and this is really, we've mentioned the President of the United States, but many actors around the world involved in either deliberate misinformation or just slightly manipulating information. And that's the great challenge for any news organization at the moment, is how do you contextualize that? How do you come back to getting things right? Now, there are certain immediate things to do. I think a lot of organizations have simply changed the way you present things in real time. If there isn't evidence, your first snap, your first 10 words will say, whoever it is, without offering evidence, said something. You'll immediately often come back when you've got a different narrative. Someone's been killed somewhere, it's been said by one side, but you haven't confirmed it from the other. There's an immediate desire now and need to present things with much, much, much more context and questioning because of the speed in which we work and also just because of the environment in which we work. So again, I think that's part of also the change in culture for working in this real-time environment, which is quite significant, I think.
Mr. Ho, I want to go to you before I move on to Mr. Liu. I also want to use the example of China-US apparent trade war. As a Singaporean media, of course, you are getting closer than most of the media when it comes to your distance to China. I mean, after all, Singapore and China have been working together since the very beginning of China's reform and opening up 40 years. And you all also share very similar languages. What exactly is the thing here that would help us to understand better about the facts on both sides, which I think is the very basic of journalism, particularly today? Let's just put it that way. Jamie.
Yeah, I think, it's without doubt that it's probably getting more and more difficult to be seen to report facts as they are, knowing full well that there are a range of other alternatives or alternative readings as to what has happened. If I could use the example, and we were talking about this off stage, about the Trump-Kim summit in Singapore, I think that's quite a good story to tell in terms of how people approach it and how someone like Channel News Asia approached it as well. So on the one hand, obviously, in an event as big as the Trump-Kim summit in Singapore, you would expect that obviously it will be seen through various different lenses depending on where you sit. But where we sat as a completely neutral arbiter and location was to tell the story exactly as it happens, as far as we possibly can. And that was our guiding ethos. We had no dog in this fight. We were neither one side or the other. And I think that was a perfect sort of representation of where Singapore and Channel News Asia stand in its coverage. And I think at the end of the day, people will come to us for that kind of analysis, that kind of coverage. And it was unprecedented coverage for us. And I think, since we were talking about this offline, I think that was very instructive, and I think that's where we actually stand as a news organization.
Mr. Liu, you also want to comment about our earlier discussed whether facts are really being reported, and particularly in a discussion where you have very clear two sides of very different opinions, and this time also involving China, which used to be not to have a very big voice, let's just put it that way, on the international stage, given the development of its history.
In fact, we are all approaching this issue from different perspectives. At the end of the day, I think this is about what is constituted as news facts and how do we approach it. We come from Info News channel of Phoenix Satellite TV, and we would like to focus on the following points in our work. First of all, we'll try our very best to present facts as they are, to present the truth as it is as best as we can. Secondly, when we select news for reports, as I said, everybody may have got their own perspective, so that very much depends on the editors. But as I had explained in that editorial from the New York Times, we know we have shortcomings, but we want to do our best as a professional. Thirdly, I really like what Aria and Sputnik have done, because they've got a Gracias Afrinia Neutrality. They've got their own news agency, their website, very clear position. For instance, in that event about the spy incident between Russia and the United Kingdom. But very interestingly, what it did was to present all the facts, even if it's news from a news agency from the UK or Ukraine, without comments. But of course, that news organization has got a very clear position, but that did not mean it couldn't present all the facts. So this is what I believe in. We, as a news organization, are allowed to have a perspective. 那其实呢，您刚才说到的这一点呢，就是在编辑和报道之间的一个差别吧。杨总，我也想听一下您从中国的角度分享一下自己的观点。当然，我并不是说您所代表的是中国外交部的观点啊。显然，我并不是外交部的发言人，甚至都代表不了 CGTN， 只能说是我自己的角度吧。我想问一下您，作为一个中国的媒体，我也能够看到呢，大家的关注的焦点。大家对于中国的观点也正在发生着改变。过去人们很不了解中国，但是大家对中国的观点可以说变得是非常复杂的。而且呢，即便是我们在 CGTN， 有时候我们没有的角度，其他人都可以了解到，而且甚至还拿他们的角度和我们的角度来做一个比较。所以，杨总，我就想问，在您看来， 来自于中国的这些声音，从比例的角度上来说，在中国之外的这些媒体，对中国的这些声音，是不是报道的不够多，还是说报道的比较多？还是说比我们预想的要多一点？从一个媒体人的角度，还有作为一个 CGTN 的管理人来说，您怎么来看？您觉得国外对于中国的这个声音报道的足够多吗？我对您的回答是这样的：国际媒体对于中国的报道呢，现在正在不断的增加，而且呢，也是变得越来越正面。我觉得是比较多面化吧。那我在这边也，因为我们在这里有各位国际的媒体人嘛，所以我坐在这边看到了来自于 BBC、CNN， 还有其他一些国际媒体的代表。我认为呢，他们做的比过去要好很多了，但尽管如此，我觉得还是不够的。再说到为什么，我认为现在呢，可以说是情况比以前变得更加的复杂，有多重的因素，其中当然也就包括，首先并不存在信息的缺失，信息是有的，缺乏的是使用信息的这个意愿，使用什么信息的意愿。如果说一个信息是真实的，但是又是由中国媒体所报道的，现在关键问题就是在于西方的媒体愿不愿意来使用。当然还有其他的一些因素，人为的一些因素也很重要。就像我的同事刚才也已经提到过了，我认为呢，每一个媒体组织，他们可能都有自己的政治的观点，或者有。
Narrative should be changed. I think both, media in Western world and developing countries too, I think we need to adjust to the changing situation. So time has changed. The world has changed. It's never the same again as like decades ago. So we have to recognize that this is a changed world. And we have to report, to the biggest extent of the fact that it's changing.
Okay, all right. Mr. Chetwynd, I don't think, first of all, Mr. Yang is arguing GDP-wise. Then we have the same proportion of coverage of different countries in the international media. Having said that, though, is there an issue that you, on a daily basis, that you have to face, struggling with different kinds of topics, and also the proportion of covering those topics, as well as the sources coming from those countries or sectors, the industries that you need to use in your coverage? How to make that balance? What are your practices these days? Can you answer some of the questions Mr. Yang just said?
Well, firstly, I'd just make a point, I think, about this idea that we're coming from any perspective. There's a tendency to talk about the Western media, we're so global in everything that we do.
I don't think we are using Western media here. Just
but I
about
think
your
just generally
practice.
in terms of foreign media and so on. I think that these are such diverse groups of people that, in actual fact, there's really no perspective that we bring to the table that isn't a pure journalistic perspective. Which I
you
think
are
is
now
important.
representing all of them AFP only. So go ahead.
Mm-hmm. So your question was really about access. And that's something that over a period of time, and certainly with regard to reporting China, that is something that has allowed the foreign media to give a much greater and more varied picture of China over time. At the end of the day, if you can't go to places and if you can't speak to the people that you want to speak to, inevitably you will come back with something that is a partial picture and an incomplete picture. So certainly from when I was in Asia 10, 15 years ago, that is something that's evolved a lot. And now our teams travel around China much more than they used to. We have greater access than we used to. We don't have as much access as we like, and we'd do a better job if we had more access. I think we'd also do a better job if we had, which we would love to do. One thing we'd love to have, we'd love to be able to employ Chinese nationals as journalists. And so that's one thing we can't do in China, which would certainly help our reporting of China for sure.
As media, please.
Sorry, can I make some comments? I think probably, the lack of access to some sort of information, especially on China, probably one factor. But still, if you have the will, or even, the kind of, I think reporting on China in a more balanced way or in a more positive way is probably not on the top priority on a lot of media organizations. But I think the technologies are there, and you can get information from everywhere. Even though probably you don't have a reporter stationed, for example, in China or in Beijing or in Shanghai, but still you have plenty of Chinese news media are on there. I mean, live on TV channels and also on the internet, social media. So I think the matter is whether you want. I think, the mindset here is much more determining factor on, how you report on China or cover China.
Phil, you probably could tell how every day Mr. Yang is squeezing us for further stories.
Well, I mean,
Go ahead.
China is one of the most interesting and compelling stories for our clients all over the world. There's just no doubt about that. So we don't lack for desire to try to tell that story, that's for sure. We have teams in Beijing, we have teams in Shanghai, but I come back to the same issue that I mentioned with regard to reporting America in the aftermath of the election of Donald Trump or the Brexit referendum. What's the response of quality journalism organizations is to double down on quality, on-the-ground reporting. So at some point it does come to access and having your people on the ground to tell the real story of what is going on. So if we come back to the China trade, for example, we'd love to get inside many, many more of your factories and the real nuts and bolts of trade so we can tell that story in a better way.
So here's the interesting thing going on already in the discussion, Ms. Wu. That is whether we are thinking about getting more ways of resources or thinking about how to best use of these resources and have it reflected in the media coverage. I'm not talking about just China, the United States, the UK, but for media organizations alike. How you report about a place and how you get your sources and whether your sources are coming from so many different backgrounds regarding that topic, and whether those sources after interview are being proportionally reflected in the reportage. That is an interesting question, isn't it, Ms. Wu?
Yeah, I appreciate this, the question. And actually, I want to just to get into the debate a little bit between Mr. Yang and Phil about...
Come on, it's not a debate between them.
Okay,
please,
so,
you join.
yeah, I will join the debate.
Join the gentlemen.
I'll just add some oil, okay? It's about the difference between several concepts: ideas, information, facts, perspectives, and maybe in general, the storytelling.
All right, every one of those on the list sounds abstract to me. Explain.
Okay, explain. When you talk about the facts and information, especially Mr. Yang mentioned really China is not like of information supply. I agree with that. And actually, compared with many other countries we cover, maybe China now really has a sufficient supply of the information. But we also are aware of the situation that all the organizations are facing. It's like we live in the ocean of information. Maybe it is too much information. So it's about really the selection of the information that you want to put into our storytelling. Then we talk about the will, right? So, but we think it's really about editorial selection or the editorial decisions we have to make every day in the newsroom. I believe you all know how difficult that decisions are. But what I'm saying is like, first is really China or other countries. We talk about, for example, the rising markets like African countries or South American countries. And of course, when we talk about European countries and or the Brexit debate, what we do is like we try to allocate and consolidate all the resources that we can mobilize. when we try to, for example, when we cover Brexit, of course, BBC had the advantage for that. So basically, what we evaluate, the facts, is like we must give the best facts that we can get hold of, because you are based in London, you have access to all those information, but you also maybe have relatively more limited resources when you are trying to cover African issue.
But you know, it's not rare that you hear from a correspondent. Many of you have been correspondents before.
So what we're trying to do
you
is
hear from the correspondent that, oh, my chief editor between, let's just say, the frontline reporter and the headquarter, and there's also the issue, further complicated by the so-called power, governments, different political views, and things like that.
Yeah.
So you got pragmatic issues going on, while at the same time you also got perception issues going on.
Yes, but I want to follow up that. It's like when you are covering some really important issues, of course you always want to have people on the ground. So we come back to China, of course. I want to just focus on that. It's like China is not lack of information, but really for all the foreign international media organizations, the common challenge is we really try to get more people who read the language, who know the local culture, who really tells the difference. And also the difference is between the official rhetoric and the public sentiment. Sometimes it's like we try to listen to more original voices from the local people. But this is something more challenging if you cover China, or you cover Africa, or you cover Europe. It's honestly speaking, we all know how difficult we try to interview some really senior positioned officials in the Chinese government, for sure. But maybe that's a difference in different societies. But what I want to say is like, resources is one thing. Decisions we are trying to make in the newsrooms, but also the access to the sufficient information or the facts that you want to put in the stories. But Mr. Yang has also mentioned another very good example I want to focus on. It's like China is getting more and more important, for sure. All the international organizations want to explain such a complex situation. China is developing quickly. China is getting more and more attention. But sometimes what we do at BBC is like we verify the sources. We say this is an official statement. Even we try to give a voice to the netizens' opinion. And we even try to say this is the most trendy topic on Weibo. But we also try to say some Chinese netizens who try to voice. So give a whole range of voices or a whole range of opinions might somehow accommodate that challenge. What we organizations all trying to face, trying to tackle. Yeah, I think it takes too much time, but definitely.
Mr. Ho, you want to add anything to any of your colleagues' opinions?
Not really. I would only say that, amongst...
I hope you are saying, yes, I will.
I can only say that, amongst such esteemed colleagues, we at Channel News Asia are probably the smallest player here.
You cannot use that as a, in a way, defense in order to say we're sitting on the fence.
Not that we are sitting on the fence, but we know we try to position ourselves, using again the Trump-Kim summit, as basically as an open storyteller as we can be, without, we know who our competitors are. As I said in my speech, my remarks just now, our only intent is to help people understand Asia from a very neutral Singapore perspective. And that's the best that we can do. I'm not going to compete with the likes of the BBC or the Wires or CGTN, but again, we come from a very unique perspective of covering Asia in English for a unique Asian perspective and an Asian audience.
Mr. Liu, your thought?
Well, I've been thinking about a topic the Chinese translation is not actually in line with the English version. We have a lack of information, we have a lack of understanding, but in Chinese, it's lack of information or lack of trust. So different wording. This would
before we do further
lead
analysis
us
about the
to
translation, what is lost, what is gained in the translation, let's just have your opinion first. What exactly are you responding to your colleagues earlier who have already said their views?
东西你有哪些补充的？
By the way, we're not here to put anybody on the spot. We're here to discuss a question that has been in our mind for a long time, and it is relevant for a media conference to deal with these questions. Otherwise, we're just saying cliches on the stage.
好，我的意思是呢，其实
我们都是老调重弹了，我们只需要谈。
更需要一些 understanding。
I think we need more understanding.
我刚才不是说了吗？以前最早的时候，
Before
话题是不是外国人对中国的媒体不信任？
it's always no trust
其实媒体
in Chinese media,
不信任的问题。
especially by Western media friends. And also now, Donald Trump is saying that American media is not to be trusted.
关于我们自己对自己的自我的反省。
And reflection is important for media friends, for media colleagues. For example, a New York Times example, they say they should be more cautious on reporting and covering stories. And now,
一个是呢失真。
by lack of information, sometimes we refer to the lack of authentic information, and the lack of attitude, lack of public trust. As media organizations in China, especially we have CCTV as the leading media organization here in China, and it's the major responsibility of CCTV to tell Chinese stories to the world. And Phoenix TV is also playing that role. We are Chinese storytellers, but how can we tell it in the good way? And can we invite foreign media friends to join us to tell Chinese stories together? Can we do this all together? And can we actually reach some agreement in terms of the value proposition as media organizations? If we can reach that agreement, we can also do it the other way around. We can also tell American story to Chinese people. So by storytelling, I think New York Times knows exactly the way how to do it. I think this month the New York Times published a report on Chinese people in Kenya, and they used some not so decent words to describe Chinese people. So maybe Chinese media organizations can also tell stories about Chinese people living in foreign countries. So we have.
I think what you're saying is perception in themselves, perception about bias in themselves are also could be subjective in a way. Mr. Chetwynd, I want you to respond to that just to be fair, because you've been attentive to listen to your colleagues. And also I want Mr. Yang to respond eventually because we're already running out of time. Mr. Chetwynd?
Well, I agree every journalist, every honest journalist in the world would accept that they bring something of their own views and personality and human frailties to everything that they do. But what I would also say is that there are facts and facts. There are not alternative facts. There are facts. And the basis of journalism is to report the facts as best you can in the context that you can.
What about the selection of facts?
Well, you have to contextualize what you do, which is important. And you have to be honest enough to say the things that you don't know, as well as the things that you know. I think that's actually one of the things that we've learned a lot in the last 5 to 10 years, especially in a real-time, live situation. You have to also be honest enough to say the things that you don't know. And that is part of the essential context of telling every story. But the basic qualities of journalism, our charter on sourcing, there are facts.
Right.
And that's what we try to do every day.
Mr. Yang, respond, please.
What I can say is probably it's natural that for a journalist to be selective in their information. Is different is how selective. And being selective is one thing, but for kind of fabrication or distortion or, faking news, that's another issue. And the other thing I want to say is if we need to tell, the China story to the world, of course we need. When I was in India to attend the Asia Media Summit in New Delhi, and one of my Indian colleagues asked me, so you have CGTN, but why India, we don't have, international broadcaster like CGTN? My answer is, you don't have the urgency to have such kind of international broadcaster because you're much better represented and portrayed by Western media, because India more or less is believed to be one of the Western community.
Okay.
But for China, we have been, voiceless for such a long time, and we do need to speak. But, in addition to this, I don't think that CGTN, its only mission is telling the China story. We tell China's story and the story of the world. Look at our content. So we do more coverage and programming on Africa, on Latin America than any other international broadcaster. So every day we have 3 hours of programming coming out from our Nairobi studio, produced by Africans. So, no, but what I mean is we're not only telling the China story, but when we tell China story, we put it in a global context.
All right.
And we tell the whole world. And let me add one more thing. I think because China has been close to the world for so long, and all of a sudden, in 4 decades of time, China is integrating to the world, and China is learning, how to integrate into the world. And the world, too, is learning how to accommodate China or how to embrace China. And I think the media has kind of a mission to facilitate that process, to make it smoother, to make it faster, to make it more beneficial to, all parties or countries concerned.
So having said that, though, I want to give everybody a fair chance. One sentence, and one sentence only from you. The biggest takeaway, if we do not agree with one another, that's perfectly natural. But one big takeaway from today's discussion, whatever it is, let's come, Ms. Wu, can I go from you? One sentence only. That sentence is not one paragraph, but only make up a few words. Okay, one sentence from you, and then followed by every one of you. One big takeaway, today's discussion.
Okay. Just make it very long.
No, you can't. Just one sentence,
Okay.
please.
Before I come, I talked to my BBC colleagues because we're now doing a season called Beyond the Fake News, which is a word that some organizations are trying to avoid, but we are not trying to avoid. So we are trying to actually bring a slide. Sorry. So just a sentence. What can we do beyond the so-called fake news? Is we try to what we do, verifying, telling the stories, investigating, share the media literacy in a good way, share the transparency, try to make transparent, demonstrating the trust.
Okay. Mr. Ho, one sentence if you can, sir.
If I would say, it's clear from what everyone's saying that there's no alternatives to facts, but there is differences in context. And all I can say from our perspective is that the context that we bring is as an Asian broadcaster in English trying to provide a voice that is independent.
Context is important. Mr. Liu, one sentence.
One sentence.
一句话，
They will never
想一
last,
想，
but we try to be better.
肯定不会最好，但是我们追求卓越。
One sentence, please.
Sure. The only way forward is to double down on quality, on-the-ground reporting.
Absolutely. Mr. Yang, one sentence. One sentence.
Okay. I have one sentence, but it has two meanings. One is advance with the times, and the other one is CGTN will continue to dialogue with the world.
Okay, all right then. We're running really out of time. Thank you so much for all of you who are pros in their field. Thank you so much for your frank discussion.